Hello, I'm Sean Gabb. I teach Latin, Greek and Classics. In this video, I will try to explain the main rules governing the Latin sequence of tenses. The sequence of tenses. Now, many GCSE and even some A-level students find the rules for the Latin sequence of tenses alarming. This is particularly the case in result and final clauses when a subjunctive must be used. In fact, the rules are fairly simple. These are that a present or future main verb takes a present subjunctive. A past main verb takes a past subjunctive. Try not to be confused when this is reworded in terms of primary and historic tenses. As long as you think in terms of present and past, you will not go very far wrong. Now the same applies in English. Take these sentences. He is shouting so that he may be heard. Now here you have a present main verb and a present passive subjunctive. Or take this one. He will shout so that he may be heard. Again, future main verb and present passive subjunctive. Or take this sentence. He shouted so that he might be heard. Past main verb and past passive subjunctive. If these examples don't make immediate sense, you will have fundamental difficulties in reading Latin. Indeed, your understanding of English is defective and you need help with this. But if these sentences do make sense, you will have no trouble when the same rules are applied in Latin. Let us then put these sentences into Latin. Clamat ut audiatur. He is shouting so that he may be heard. You have a present main verb, clamat, and a present passive subjunctive, audiatur. He is shouting so that he may be heard. Clamat ut audiatur. Clamabit ut audiatur. He will shout so that he may be heard. Here you have a future main verb and a present passive subjunctive. He will shout so that he may be heard. Clamabit ut audiatur. Clamavit ut audiretur. He shouted so that he might be heard. Past main verb and imperfect passive subjunctive. I've used the form here past main verb because there is an apparent difficulty in Latin. Take this further example. Clamavit ut audiatur. Now here you have a past main verb and a present passive subjunctive. Here we have a past main tense followed by a past subjunctive tense. Is this an exception to the allegedly simple rule given above? No. It is simply an example of the defective grammar of Latin. In its evolution from the Indo-European ancestor language that it shares with Greek and English, Latin has lost a number of parts. One of these is the aorist tense. Now, The aorist tense represents a simple and a complete action in the past that has no effect on the present. The perfect tense represents a past action that still affects the present. To show you what this means, let's take these sentences in English. He shouted so that he might be heard. An aorist main verb plus past passive subjunctive. He shouted. He shouted yesterday. He shouted 20 years ago. He shouted at some point in the past, a completely indefinite past, so that he might be heard. And so this is a use of the aorist. He has shouted so that he may be heard. Now this means that he has shouted just now. You might still hear the echoes of his shouting, and he has shouted so that he may be heard. The problem in Latin is that the forms of the aorist tense have disappeared, and they are expressed by the perfect tense. Therefore, let us look again at these tenses. Clamavit ut audiretur. He shouted so that he might be heard. You know that it means that because you have an aorist main verb plus an imperfect passive subjunctive. Again, he shouted at some indefinite time in the past. Maybe yesterday, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 2,000 years ago. He shouted. He shouted, it's over and done with. And he shouted so that he might be heard. Let's now look at the true perfect in Latin. Clamavit ut audiatur. He has shouted so that he may be heard. Perfect main verb and present passive subjunctive. He has shouted, and again, he has shouted so recently that you may still hear the echo of his shouting, and he has shouted so that he may be heard. This is a kind of past in the present. It is a past tense which still operates in the present. You might use the similar examples of I cooked dinner, in brackets 20 years ago. I have cooked dinner, and here it is on the table. This is the difference between the aorist and the perfect. The meaning of this is that when clamavit means I have shouted, it is effectively a present tense, and so takes a present subjunctive. When it means I shouted, it is a true perfect tense, and so takes a past subjunctive. What is called the perfect tense in Latin contains both true perfect and aorist, and what clamavit actually means must be inferred either from the general context or from the tense of any subjunctive that it governs. When a perfect is followed by a subjunctive, you know at once whether it is true perfect or aorist. You can tell from the tense of the subjunctive. When you see a perfect in a sentence without any attached subjunctive, you have to use your judgment to tell its nature. Therefore, have a look at this. Dixit puer. This can mean the boy said, aorist. The boy said something yesterday. The boy said something 100 years ago. Whatever he said has no effect, no grammatical effect in the present. But Dixit puer can also mean the boy has said. The boy has said something to me, and he is still standing in front of me to take questions on what he may have said. This may sound confusing, but the confusion only becomes critical if you are translating into Latin and you have to use a subjunctive. So long as you know this hidden distinction between aorist and perfect, and so long as you're able to recognize the subjunctive tenses, you will not go wrong when translating from Latin. And I really don't believe that if you come across a sentence like dixit puer, you'll have to sit pondering whether this has an aorist meaning or if it is a true perfect. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, please check out my other Latin videos. You may also wish to check out my classics teaching website, www.classicstuition.co.uk. Many thanks.